Mortain, France, August 7th, 1944. The fog was thick, the kind that muffled sound and made the night feel endless. Beyond the hills, German tanks were moving, a deep, rhythmic growl that rolled through the valley like thunder trapped underground. Colonel Paul F. Disney stood over a field map inside a ruined farmhouse. The windows rattled from distant artillery. His men, the 120th Infantry Regiment, had been ordered to hold this sector, no matter what. Headquarters' last transmission was clear. Do not engage offensively. Wait for authorization. Authorization wasn't coming. Through the static on the radio came fragments of chaos, outposts overrun, anti-tank guns silenced, an entire company disappearing without a word. Scouts reported columns of German armor cutting off the road west to Avranches, the artery feeding the entire Allied front. If that road fell, every tank in Patton's army would run dry. Disney's aide, a young lieutenant, looked pale. "Sir, HQ says hold position." Disney didn't look up. "We hold, we die." He stared at the map, then at the men outside. Tired faces lit by the glow of cigarette tips. Infantry without tanks. Artillery with barely a dozen shells left. And somewhere in the mist, the 2nd SS Panzer Division advancing straight for them. He knew the rules. No counterattack without division command. No independent fire orders. The manuals were full of procedures. Neat, logical, suicidal. Disney folded the map. "Get me the artillery battery." The lieutenant hesitated. "Sir, that's unauthorized." "So is dying in silence." He turned to the radio operator. "Cut HQ frequency, switch to local net." There was a pause, one of those moments that stretches a lifetime. Then the operator obeyed. Disney keyed the mic. "All batteries open fire. Target grid 628. Infantry will move on my command." In that instant, Paul F. Disney broke U.S. Army protocol, international law, and the sacred chain of command. Outside, the first American shells screamed into the fog. By dawn, the German offensive at Mortain, Operation Lüttich, had smashed straight into his illegal counterattack. And somewhere in the chaos, the 120th Infantry was still standing. He should have been court-martialed. Instead, he would become the man who saved an entire division by doing everything he wasn't supposed to do. Every army builds itself on one promise, that discipline wins wars. Orders flow downward, obedience flows upward, and the machine stays intact. That belief kept millions of soldiers moving across continents. It also nearly destroyed them. In theory, order creates strength. But in practice, by the summer of 1944, order had become a cage. Communication across the Allied front lagged hours behind reality. Commanders at corps level issued instructions for battles that had already changed shape. Men in the field were told to hold at all costs while enemy tanks surrounded them. That's what happened at Mortain. Colonel Paul F. Disney wasn't a renegade by nature. He had built his career on precision and discipline. But by August, he had learned that command from afar could kill faster than bullets. The higher the rank, the older the map. When orders came to await authorization, the situation on the ground was already collapsing. Mortain was surrounded by panzers. The Germans weren't probing. They were striking for the coast. Their goal was Avranches, the single road connecting Normandy to the rest of France. If they cut that lifeline, the entire Allied invasion could be trapped and starved. And yet the order stood. No movement, no counterattack, no initiative. In theory, that made sense. Coordinated control prevents friendly fire, avoids chaos, and ensures unity. But it assumes that communication survives the battle. It assumes someone at headquarters can still see the truth. Disney could see it. Through the fog, through the smoke, through the slow unraveling of his regiment's lines. He could hear it in the silence on the radio, the calls that never came back. He realized that obedience in that moment meant annihilation. So he broke the rule that every officer swore to uphold. And in doing so, proved why that rule couldn't survive real war. The myth of discipline as the ultimate weapon had blinded armies for generations. But at Mortain, one man's defiance showed that war was not a science of obedience. It was a geometry of instinct, judgment drawn in fire. He didn't disobey to be a hero. He disobeyed because no one else could see the map in front of him, and by the time headquarters understood, he had already changed the course of the battle. By the first week of August 1944, the Allied front in Normandy looked unstoppable on paper. Patton's armored columns were racing through Brittany. Montgomery's divisions pressed east toward Paris. And Eisenhower's headquarters believed the Germans were finished. But beneath that optimism was a flaw that every soldier on the ground could feel: command paralysis. The Allied chain of command had grown heavy, like an engine with too many gears. Orders passed through layers of coordination, translated, reapproved, delayed. A directive from Bradley's 12th Army Group could take 6 hours to reach a colonel under fire. Radios crackled with half-finished sentences. Wires were cut by shell fire. And by the time orders arrived, they no longer fit the battlefield that existed. At Mortain, that flaw would be exposed brutally. Operation Lüttich, Hitler's last attempt to throw the Allies back into the sea, was already underway. He had ordered 4 panzer divisions, including the elite 2nd SS Das Reich and 116th Panzer, to strike west toward Avranches. If successful, they would sever Patton's supply line and trap the entire U.S. Third Army. For the men of the 30th Infantry Division, it meant facing over 120 German tanks, with little more than rifles, bazookas, and a handful of anti-tank guns. The division held a front that stretched 5 miles, defended by barely 700 men. Disney's regiment, the 120th Infantry, sat right in the middle of that storm. His orders were simple: hold the line. But every scout report told a different story. German armor moving in formation, artillery zeroing in, American outposts vanishing without a signal. When he radioed division command for updates, he got static. The phone lines were dead. The nearest tank battalion was already retreating south. Still, the command structure remained frozen. The manuals demanded coordination. The generals demanded discipline, even as the enemy surrounded them. No one authorized a counterattack. The irony was cruel. The Allies had built the most organized fighting machine in history. But on the ground, that same organization became quicksand. Orders took too long to move. Decisions arrived too late. Colonel Disney saw it for what it was: a perfect plan for losing. Inside his command tent, he studied his situation map. The red lines marking enemy positions closed around his regiment like claws. He knew if he followed procedure, his men would be gone before dawn. War, he realized, had turned into a waiting game, and the ones who waited died first. So he made a decision that no radio, no manual, and no general could ever authorize. He would take command of his own war. Every legend begins with numbers that make survival look impossible. Mortain was one of those places. On paper, the 30th Infantry Division was holding firm. In reality, it was being swallowed. At 0200 hours on August 7, 1944, the German attack began. The opening of Operation Lüttich. 6 panzer divisions struck west through the fog, including the 2nd SS Das Reich and the 1st SS Leibstandarte. Together they fielded more than 120 tanks and 5,000 infantry, supported by heavy artillery and Luftwaffe bombers. Against them stood roughly 700 men of the 120th Infantry Regiment, most dug into shallow foxholes short on ammunition, with only a dozen functioning anti-tank guns and 3 57mm pieces. The ratio was absurd, nearly 10 German soldiers for every American. Communications delays made everything worse. Field reports later showed an average 90-minute gap between a frontline distress call and headquarters acknowledgement. When a position fell, it often took half a day before the higher command even realized it. The radio net was clogged, the lines cut, and the chain of command, that perfect pyramid of authority, had turned into a dead circuit. Meanwhile, Hitler's plan was explicit. The panzers were to push straight to Avranches, cut off Patton's Third Army, and isolate the Allied beachhead in Normandy. If they succeeded, the entire Allied advance, over 250,000 men, would be trapped between the sea and the German line. The weight of that math was unbearable. The 30th Division wasn't just fighting for itself. It was the wall standing between the Allies and catastrophe. By Euro 400, the first German tanks reached Disney's sector. Panthers rolled out of the fog, their engines growling like engines of inevitability. American bazookas bounced off their armor. A single shell from a Panther's 75mm gun could vaporize a squad. Disney's artillery had 5 minutes of shells left. His anti-tank guns were already burning. The last message from headquarters told him to hold ground, await further instruction. There would be no instruction. He looked at the faces of the men around him. Farm boys from Iowa, machinists from Ohio, kids who'd been told discipline was stronger than steel. He saw their rifles trembling, not from fear, but from understanding. They were being ordered to die by the book. That's when Disney made his choice. If the math of war couldn't save them, then he'd change the equation himself. It wasn't bravery. It was arithmetic, the only kind that made sense when the difference between obedience and extinction was one radio transmission too late. At 0430 hours, the fog at Mortain was so thick that visibility dropped to 20 yards. The Germans were ghosts, engines without shapes, steel moving through smoke. The ground trembled as panzers advanced uphill toward the 120th Infantry's position. Inside a shattered farmhouse that served as command post, Colonel Paul F. Disney stood over the radio. Static. The line to division command was dead again. His artillery forward observer shouted from outside, "They're coming through the orchard!" The order from higher command still sat on the table. Hold. Do not engage offensively. Disney read it once more, folded the page, and slid it into his pocket. To hell with that, he turned to his staff. We're counterattacking. The room went silent. One of his captains blinked. Sir, that's not authorized. Disney lit a cigarette with hands that didn't shake. Neither is dying in formation. Tell the men to fix bayonets. He stepped outside into the fog where his soldiers were crouched in trenches. Listen up, he shouted. The panzers are blind in this soup. We hit them now or they roll over us. No one's coming to save us. We save ourselves. No one argued. He coordinated his artillery manually without clearance, ordering his gunners to open fire on pre-sighted coordinates. Within seconds, the quiet hills erupted, a line of explosions tearing through the mist. The German advance staggered, momentarily disoriented. Move, Disney yelled. Infantry squads surged forward, slipping through mud and smoke. Mortars fired blind, shells bursting in the fog. The Americans closed to within 50 yards before the Germans even realized they were counterattacking. It wasn't strategy, it was instinct. The fog, the terrain, and the timing turned what should have been suicide into chaos the Germans couldn't read. They had expected a static defense. Instead, they ran into fury. Disney moved with the first wave, shouting orders, dragging a machine gun crew forward when one man froze. His voice cut through the artillery like steel on stone. Panzer shells tore craters around them. A fragment grazed his shoulder. He didn't stop. Keep moving. They're not gods, they're just men in metal. By 0700, his illegal offensive had punched straight into the German flank. His regiment recaptured the crossroad west of Mortain, the supply artery that had been considered lost. From that position, his artillery could finally see the German column spread along the valley. Disney grabbed the field phone. Fire for effect, full battery. 6 American guns answered. The shells rained into the convoy, detonating fuel trucks, flipping half-tracks. The hillside glowed orange through the fog. At Euro 900, the counterattack, entirely unauthorized, entirely improvised, had collapsed the German spearhead. The 2nd SS Panzer's lead units were forced to pull back. When the smoke cleared, the 120th Infantry was still standing. One major walked up to Disney, shaking his head. "Sir, that move was illegal as hell." Disney smiled faintly, eyes red from smoke. "Then let's hope the law never finds us." His men laughed, not from relief, but disbelief. Against every rule, every number, and every plan, they were alive. And somewhere in the fog, the panzers were not. When the fog lifted, the battlefield looked like an equation solved in fire. Burned-out tanks lay nose down in ditches. German infantry fled across open fields, leaving weapons behind. What began as a forbidden counterattack had detonated into a chain reaction that changed the entire front. By the time higher command realized what Disney had done, the outcome was already irreversible. His illegal maneuver had broken the timing of the German offensive. The 2nd SS and 116th Panzer Divisions, which were supposed to strike together, were now separated by several miles. Their flanks were exposed, their communication lines shattered. That 12-hour delay was everything. It gave the U.S. the 1919 Corps enough time to reposition reserves and bring in the 35th Infantry Division from the south. By nightfall, Allied air power had cleared, and fighter-bombers roared over Mortain like a curtain of thunder. Disney's defiance had bought the sky back. The math of the battle was staggering. Within 48 hours, the German counteroffensive lost over 3,000 men and 120 vehicles, including 40 tanks. The advance that Hitler believed would collapse the Allied front never got past Mortain. And the irony was cruel. Every Allied after-action report credited coordinated resistance for the victory. No one mentioned the order that was never given, or the man who had broken every regulation to make it happen. If Disney had waited for permission, his regiment would have been erased before sunrise. Avranches would have fallen. Patton's Third Army, 250,000 men, would have been stranded without fuel or ammunition. Normandy could have turned into a second Dunkirk. Instead, one colonel's refusal to wait rewrote the tempo of the war. Headquarters eventually sent new orders, but they arrived 12 hours too late. They told him to prepare a controlled withdrawal. He laughed, tore the message in half, and kept fighting. In the end, his insubordination didn't just save a regiment. It saved a corridor of survival stretching across France. The chain of command had frozen. He had become the missing link that forced it to move again. And though history would write the victory as methodical, the men who were there knew the truth. It was born from disobedience, calculated by instinct and signed in artillery smoke. At first light on August 8th, the fog began to thin. Mortain was still burning, the air thick with cordite and smoke, but the sound of battle was shifting. From chaos to rhythm. The Germans had lost their momentum, their panzers scattered along the valley floor. And in the middle of it all, Colonel Paul Disney's regiment was still moving. A young lieutenant from Disney's staff later described that morning, "It didn't feel like victory. It felt like we were still inside a thunderstorm that didn't know which way to roll." Disney's men moved along the narrow road to Avranches, clearing pockets of resistance. The asphalt was cratered, the fields beside it littered with twisted steel. In places, German half-tracks smoldered with black smoke, their crews still slumped over the guns. "Keep that road open," Disney shouted over the noise. "If it closes, we lose the whole war." He rode in an open jeep, mud spraying over his uniform. Radio chatter crackled. German armor regrouping north of Hill 314. Infantry digging in near the church ruins. The colonel ordered his 2nd Battalion to flank left and hold the ridge. Hill 314 wasn't just high ground. It was an observation point that commanded the entire valley. Whoever held it could direct artillery on everything that moved below. Disney climbed the slope with his forward observers, using field glasses to peer through the smoke. Below them, the German column was trying to reform. Tanks refueling. Infantry pulling back under fire. "Get me Battery C," he said into the radio. "Target coordinates 271. Full salvo." The guns answered moments later. The first shell landed squarely on a fuel truck, the second on a tank convoy. The valley erupted in a chain of explosions that rolled like thunder through the morning haze. From that hill, Disney's regiment directed fire for the next 6 hours. Every German attempt to advance ended in flame. 68 vehicles were destroyed in a single morning. Infantrymen below joked that the colonel was painting with artillery. By noon, Allied fighter bombers arrived, P-47 Thunderbolts screaming low over the valley. Pilots later said the smoke columns rising from Disney's coordinates were so precise they didn't need ground markers. From the top of Hill 314, he watched the panzers burn and said quietly, "That's for the boys who didn't make it through the night." The road to Avranches stayed open. The German offensive stalled for good. But as the day ended, the cost of defiance began to weigh on him. He knew his actions had violated every regulation. He knew reports would reach headquarters. Yet watching the last Panther explode in the distance, he didn't care. He turned to his lieutenant and said, "If this was illegal, then maybe war needs more crime." When the guns finally fell silent over Mortain, the valley looked like the wreckage of a machine that had run itself to death. Smoke drifted low across fields of twisted armor. The 120th Infantry held its ground, but the price was everywhere. Burned trucks, shattered helmets, men who hadn't slept in 2 days. Colonel Paul F. Disney stood beside a wrecked jeep, drinking black coffee that tasted like gunpowder. His uniform was torn, his face gray with soot. Someone handed him a message from division headquarters. It wasn't congratulations. He was ordered to report immediately to Corps Command for review of unauthorized action under combat conditions. The words hit harder than any artillery shell. The war wasn't over for him, not yet. 2 days later, he walked into the command tent of the 30th Infantry Division. General Hobbs sat behind a field desk, expression unreadable. Around him were staff officers, maps, and a thick folder marked Mortain Incident. Disney saluted. "Sir, I take full responsibility." Hobbs looked at him for a long moment. "You counterattacked without authorization. You opened fire before confirmation. You broke radio silence." "Yes, sir. And in doing so, you saved my entire division." The tent went quiet. Hobbs closed the folder. "Do you have any idea what would have happened if you hadn't acted?" Disney hesitated. "Yes, sir." "We'd be gone." The general leaned back, exhaled. "You're not going to see a medal for this, Colonel. Not today. Maybe not ever. Officially, you disobeyed orders. Unofficially," he paused, "you gave me a reason to believe in judgment again." The court-martial recommendation disappeared into the paper fog of bureaucracy. The file was never processed. A single note replaced it. Action justified by operational success. Headquarters didn't speak of it again. The reports credited effective local command initiative for halting the German offensive. No mention of disobedience. No mention of law broken to save law itself. Years later, when the war was over and the records declassified, historians found fragments, field transmissions, after-action notes, artillery logs that didn't match official orders. The truth surfaced slowly, like wreckage from the deep. Disney had indeed ignored every standing order, and by doing so, he'd altered the course of the battle that secured the Allied breakout from Normandy. He retired quietly after the war. No decorations beyond the usual campaign ribbons. When asked about Mortain, he only said, "Sometimes you don't wait for permission to do what's right." The men who had fought under him remembered differently. To them, he wasn't the colonel who broke rules. He was the one who broke the silence that was killing them. And though the archives called him a disciplinarian, the front remembered him as something else entirely. The man who made disobedience holy for one night in Normandy. History likes order. It prefers neat timelines, proper approvals, victories achieved through obedience. It doesn't know what to do with men like Colonel Paul F. Disney, the ones who see a disaster coming and decide to ignore the system that made it inevitable. At Mortain, the manual said wait for command. He didn't. They said preserve formation. He broke it. They said discipline wins wars. He proved judgment does. In the chaos of total war, the difference between a hero and a criminal is measured in outcomes, not orders. If Disney's counterattack had failed, he would have been court-martialed, stripped of command, maybe imprisoned. The same act that saved thousands would have condemned one man. That's the paradox of command. When the system freezes, it takes one defiant voice to keep it alive. The German generals after the war admitted that Mortain was their breaking point. We had the men, the tanks, the plan, one wrote. But the Americans did not behave logically. They counterattacked through fog and fire, as if they had no fear. What they didn't know was that logic had been thrown away, replaced by necessity and instinct. Disney's mutiny never made it into official histories. His name didn't appear in textbooks or documentaries. But the silence around him speaks louder than medals ever could. He became the invisible proof that order alone cannot win a war. Armies need men willing to see beyond instructions, men who can tell the difference between obedience and surrender. Discipline builds an army, one of his sergeants said years later, but judgment keeps it alive. That was the math of Mortain. One unauthorized act multiplied by courage equaled survival for thousands. When war ended, Disney packed away his uniform. Never spoke about that night again. But those who were there still remembered the moment he looked at the radio, heard nothing from command, and said softly, "Then I'll speak for them." And with that, he reminded the world that sometimes the most lawful act in war is to break the law that's killing you. Colonel Paul F. Disney never received a medal for Mortain. No ceremony, no citation, no recognition beyond a few quiet handshakes from the men who lived because of him. History recorded his regiment's stand as effective resistance under difficult conditions. Nothing about the order he ignored, or the silence he defied. But every soldier who survived that valley knew the truth. That discipline might win parades, but judgment wins wars. Disney retired in silence. He never defended what he did, never glorified it. When asked years later whether he regretted disobeying orders, he said only, "I regret that obedience would have killed us." The chain of command still needed men like him, ones willing to break it when the system broke first.